Morning, everybody.
Morning.
That's bright. Thanks for coming. Everybody get their coffee? Hopefully? Yeah, I did. Probably gonna wish I had brought more. Really excited to be here. Thanks for coming. Really excited to be speaking at this event. This is a really awesome event, I'm sure. How many folks have been here? Is this their first time at BSides Delaware? Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot. That's great. That's really good. Yeah. My first year was 3 years ago. It was really great. I love the event. Love how passionate everybody is here, and how kid friendly it is. Really, my kids are a little young for this, but they'll be in a few years they'll be interested in some of the events that they set up. So that's really cool. So today I'm going to be talking about cybersecurity effectiveness. I'd really appreciate it if folks would be willing to raise your hand, ask questions. Don't throw anything, ideally, but get my attention. Definitely want to have a dialogue and hear your experiences. So how many folks here work in IT security within an organization? Okay, decent percentage. And are there any consultants? Anybody does IT security consulting? So some of this will, I do IT security consulting, and this is basically just what I've learned over the years is an effective strategy for helping organizations really determine whether or not the work that they're doing with their cybersecurity program is time well spent, money well spent. Oh, I've got this clicker, so let's see how it goes. This is me. This is a little bit about myself. CISO and founder at Rule 4. So like I said before, we do cybersecurity consulting at Drexel Dragon. My wife is a Drexel Dragon too. She won't admit it. She got her second degree at Drexel, but she's a blue hen at heart, so she's much more of a Delaware fan. Cat lover and ex-theater geek. As you can see, this is what I spent my youth doing. I didn't get into IT till I was in late high school, and I didn't know that hiking was a special ability, but you can put anything you want on a resume, so, or on a headshot, so yeah. So I've been helping clients with their IT security strategy for over 10 years now. One consistent theme that I've seen is a lack of metrics, lack of an ability to define success within cybersecurity. It's always been a challenge, right? Most business units are required to have some sort of a metric to say, here's my plan for the year, here's how I'm going to define success over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And cybersecurity has always struggled with that. It's one of those, it's like being a ref, nobody notices you until something bad happens, right? And I don't necessarily feel that that's fair or true. I think that there are methods that you can use to try to create some level of measurement, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. I even had a client the other day ask me, hey, can you send me some talking points for this assessment we want to do so that I can share that with my boss? It's like, it's a challenge for us to convince people that the time that we're spending and the money that we're spending and the projects we want to do are worthwhile, that they're things that we should be spending our time and money on. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to help our clients be able to do this, be able to measure this, the effectiveness of their programs, be able to communicate the purpose, the reasoning behind their initiatives, without hiring us to help them necessarily, right? So this is my Thanksgiving tie-in. So my takeaway, so my basic point here is that when it comes to measuring return on investment, key performance indicators, effectiveness as a whole for cybersecurity programs, we're mostly just winging it, right? We don't really have a strong way to actually communicate to management, hey, this is how we're effective in our jobs. Like, this is how we define success. Other than, no breaches, of course, right? Like, we haven't had a breach this year, that's a success, sure. But how else can we measure whether or not we're effectively using our budget or our, the projects that we're choosing are the right ones? So a few definitions, terms that I want to make sure we're all on the same page about while we go through this journey. Effectiveness is to produce the intended or expected result, right? I think it's given up. Oh, here we go, efficiency. So efficiency, right? So one definition, the ability to accomplish a job with a minimum expenditure of time and effort. I think we all get that, right? I'm going to tie in efficiency into the effectiveness conversation because I think they're really closely related, especially with what we do in IT and IT security is an extension of that. I like this definition better, and I'll tell you why. So the ratio of work done or energy developed by a machine, right, compared to the energy supplied to it. And the reason I like this definition of efficiency better in this context is when we're talking efficiency within IT, a lot of times we're talking about leveraging automation, leveraging technologies to be efficient. So in my mind, it does function a lot more like this kind of a definition of, you know, is our system working efficiently? So I created this definition of cybersecurity effectiveness as the ability to measure the value and success of a cybersecurity program against organizationally relevant metrics. And you know, in my mind, that's what we're all striving for. And I think that my goal here will be to express to you what I feel like is an effective method for doing it. Let's see. There we go. A little bit of, you know, stats about, you know, this area in general, right? A third of companies, you know, this is Psychotic's State of Cybersecurity Metrics report, which is basically a survey of executives in, you know, CISO and CIO type roles. So a third of companies invest in technology without a way to measure it, to measure effectiveness. 4 out of 5 companies are not satisfied with their cybersecurity metrics, which makes sense if a third of the companies aren't even investing or measuring effectiveness in the first place. You can't possibly be satisfied with your metrics, right? You don't have any. 4 out of 5 fail to include business stakeholders in cybersecurity investment decisions, and that's going to be a theme too. We'll talk about is you know, working across teams, and 75% don't even know where their sensitive data is located, and that's kind of a, you know, I mean, if you don't know where your sensitive data is located, it's going to be really hard to have a cybersecurity program that's effective, much less measure effectiveness of it. So I thought those were interesting. I imagine that 2018 won't be much different. I do not want, right? That is not the state we want to be in. As fast as technology is moving and changing, as more and more connected we get, as we start moving into these IoT realms, as we start leveraging technologies that we understand even less, like machine learning, it's going to be critically important that we have an understanding of how we can measure that the work we're doing, which is incredibly important, is effective. So not only for our own selves, so that we can feel like we have an understanding and a grasp of what we're trying to accomplish, what our goals are, what our indicators of success are, but also so that we can make an argument to leadership to say, hey, spend the money, this is worthwhile, we're doing a good job. God, those orange slides, I'm sure they're blinding you as well, but they're really blinding coming out of the...
You have a good tan.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's good, right? Yeah, I'm going for that. This is the only way I'm ever going to get a tan. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple scenarios here, right? So there's 2 scenarios I'm going to talk through. They're generic. They're obviously not, they don't, you know, they're not all-encompassing, but the idea here is to set the stage a little bit about what organizations are doing today. Okay, so step 1, a typical cybersecurity program, find a checklist or a standard to start with, right? So can folks just start shouting out standards, checklists that they use, or standards that they're familiar with, cybersecurity standards, and I'm going to throw candy at you to get you to engage.
RMF?
Say what?
RMF?
RMF. And who else? We'll see how well I can throw.
PCI.
PCI? Wow, these don't fly well.
Yeah.
FISMA? Whew, I should have picked like candy bars or something. What else?
Nist.
Nist? Ah! Wake up, everybody. It could be coming your way. Anybody else? HIPAA, right? The cybersecurity framework. What is that? I trust.
Critical security controls.
Critical security
Controls.
Jesus. Okay. I'm going to stop there before I hurt somebody. So we all know the security standards, right? Whether they're regulatory standards, compliance standards, or just generic IT security standards that we can apply as we choose to apply them. So, okay, so we pick a standard, follow that checklist or standard, and we profit, right? That's how it works, right? So as long as we have a standard, we're okay. And I think, everybody, I don't think this is anything that people here think is crazy, right? Tell me if you disagree with me. I mean, for sure, compliance does not equal cybersecurity. It does play an incredibly important role, right? That's where the caveat is, not alone, not by itself. But I think a lot of organizations, that's, okay, so what are we gonna do? We're gonna, so we have credit card security, we're gonna follow PCI. Or we are a healthcare organization, we'll follow HIPAA, which is barely a standard, really. So that's one scenario. So I wrote an ode to security standards. I'm not gonna lie, I actually just went online and found like a poem creator. But security standards have their place, they're important. And we'll talk a little bit more about how they fit into that cybersecurity effectiveness model when we get a little further down. Scenario 2, find the next hot tech product, right? Machine learning is gonna fix all of our cybersecurity problems, right? Find the next, install it, right? Maybe you pay the vendor to help you install it, or maybe you do it on your own. Maybe you have the skills in-house to tune it correctly, maybe not. It just depends, right? But a lot of times we're being driven by something that somebody at the executive level heard, a term. We went and saw some vendor reviews, or went to a conference and had some vendors talk to us about their products. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to solve problems, but we're solving them through, in this case, by finding a solution, putting it in place, and hoping that that gives us what we're looking for from a protection perspective. You got profit, right? But products don't equal cybersecurity either, not alone. They have a place. They are important to have access to, whether they're a product you pay for, whether they're SaaS, whether they're in, on-premise, whether they're open source, or not. We have to have a suite of tools in order to be effective at our jobs. But if we start by looking for a product and then go figure out what problems it can solve, we're going to end up in a state where we are spending money that we don't necessarily need to spend and aren't necessarily effectively protecting our environment. I was going to do a limerick, and then I realized that this is not something I'm any good at. So, okay, so those are the scenarios. Just want to kind of set the stage, right? And I see this a lot in consulting. We are brought in with our clients to help with all sorts of problems, whether it's picking a product, right? Sometimes a client will come and say, hey, help us select this solution for SSO. And so the first thing we'll do is say, take a step back. Which problem are you trying to solve? Well, we want SSO. Well, that's not the problem you're trying to solve. You have an identity management problem, or an access management problem, or whatever. Well, what's that look like in your organization before we start laying products over the top of it, right? And so that's kind of the point behind those scenarios, is to remind us all, okay, well, we need to start from the right place before we can really leverage things like tools, or before we can effectively leverage standards and compliance regulations. So, share if you want. How do you measure effectiveness of your program, right? If you're in a place to do that, like, do you have a method that you use? Do you feel comfortable with understanding how well you're doing with your cybersecurity program?
Number of firewall blocks on a particular technology.
Data-driven, number of firewall blocks. Anybody else?
I just like to say, it's not easy. It's not easy at all.
True, absolutely.
There's frameworks and all that, but there's no tie-in to how you measure, against them.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain things, the obvious, right? Like the number of events, in a particular system. But outside of that, you just kind of make it up, right? And sometimes it's not even worth anything. You're doing it just to do it, right? Just to put together some kind of PowerPoint to say, hey, senior management, we're doing something.
Right, and how often are they really digging into it or really understanding what you're putting together, right? Yeah.
I absolutely second that. Since I have to do that monthly, but I've had it blocked for KPIs for years now, because what is, other than firewall blocks that can come and go depending on the quarter of the day is being scanned, what does it matter?
Right. Yep.
We kind of do it anecdotally, like, so our non-incidents, we actually report to our management on a weekly basis. So if we analyze something, we saw that our application whitelisted prevented it, we write up a short summary, we present that to them in a 2-line brief of each nonsense that happens.
I love that. I think that's great. Right? And so, there's ways that we figured out how to do this, and we're trying, and we're evolving. I like to think about, the folks that are really driving these types of conversations in IT security, a lot of times taught themselves all this stuff, right? Like I did. Like I didn't. Right? Like I studied some of this in school, and I wasn't a security major, and certainly back then those programs were not what they are today. And so we're all learning how to do this. And coming from a technical background and then being asked to do something like measure effectiveness or figure out what is a KPI and how do I use it? Like those are all things that don't come naturally necessarily to all of us. And some people easier than others, but definitely challenging. My report says I'm compliant, so that's when we hear a lot. Like we had somebody come do a report and they said we're good to go. My software security as a service dashboard is green, so clearly that means I'm good to go. I'm busy, right? So if we're like a fire drill driven organization, which most are, I mean, obviously we're all gonna have fire drills to deal with, but some are crazier than others. I have some good stories I'm not gonna go into now about that, but definitely a spectrum when it comes to that. But so if I'm busy, it must be, our program must be working. I don't know. That's a tough question, right? Like we just talked about, it's not an easy question to answer. Compliant and versus non-compliant is one piece of a larger puzzle. Products are tools. They're not solutions in and of themselves. Standards are guides. Regulations, they're scope limited. PCI cares about credit card security. They could care less if you have availability problems. They don't care. They just want to make sure the credit card numbers are being protected. There's a better way. At least I think there is, and hopefully you guys agree. And super excited to hear your opinions on what we talk about today, and if you think I'm full of crap, or if you have thoughts on ways to improve this. But my goal is to try to help us all think about, well, how could we more effectively be effective? That doesn't make sense. But how can we really understand what our goals are from a cybersecurity program and be measuring? Okay, so where do we start? Foundations are super important. If you don't start with a strong foundation, a strong understanding of your environment, you're going to struggle to make good decisions. So step one, if you don't have an inventory of your environment, system inventory, asset inventory, including especially data, if you don't have a clear understanding of where your data is, what kind of data you have, you're not going to be able to measure anything effectively, right? And that's important. And it's, to some folks this might sound really obvious, and it is to some extent, but where they don't have full insight because the way that the organization is built, right, from a process perspective. So you've got, oh, well, I'm in IT security, but I don't have any control over if the developers decide to go put something in AWS. Or there's no way for me to know if the marketing team hired somebody to spin up a website. Or those types of things make it really hard for IT security to be effective at their jobs. And so having an understanding of, if I'm going to be effective at building this program, I have to have some insight. I don't have to have control, but organizationally, we have to make it a commitment to ensuring that IT security has insight into these processes, whatever they are. And so sometimes that's easier said than done, but definitely important. Without that, it's going to be a real challenge for us to be effective. We can be effective in bits and pieces, but not have a full program. Back to compliance and regulatory requirements. If we understand our data, we know where our data is, what kind of data it is, we can then make sure that we understand our compliance requirements. That's really important. We have to understand it in order to make good decisions, and we'll talk about why in a minute, but I think we're all familiar with, the dangers of not realizing you have a bunch of PCI data in your environment, and then you have a breach, and suddenly putting your entire organization at risk of not being able to process credit cards or getting fines and things like that. No, just kidding. We're not ready to do that yet. There's more than 2 steps, surprisingly, to being able to measure effectiveness of your cybersecurity program. Psych. I really like Parks and Rec. I don't know if you can tell, but I do. So then the next step, right? Threat analysis, risk analysis, risk indicators. And this all sounds like a lot of work, and You know, it is work, right? But it's worthwhile to do. And so I've worked through these processes with organizations, and a lot of times they'll come to a consultant, us or someone else, whatever, because they don't really have the drive or the understanding to do it themselves internally. But if we can teach them these tools and let them do it themselves moving forward, it allows them as an organization to take ownership and make better choices and be less reliant on outside parties. So I don't mean like this kind of risk assessment. Not that these are bad. I've done lots of really super detailed risk assessments with lots of categories and ratings, and there's lots of standards around risk assessment that give you a lot of options, right? But this is not what I'm talking about here, not today, right? This is more than what we need. This is more like what I'm talking about. Something simple that just says, what are our threats, and what is the likelihood of that threat being realized within our environment? What is the impact of that threat if it were to be exploited, right? If it were to come to fruition? And just having an understanding from a low, medium, high, extreme risk perspective does wonders for our ability to define what is effective for us in our cybersecurity program. Just those little steps, just to be able to say, yeah, this is a really high risk area. We have PHI in AWS. That's where our most sensitive data is. Probably we should spend more money there than on, you know, an MDM solution when we don't even allow our employees to have access to email or whatever, right? Just defining where is it that we should be spending our time and focusing. Because we all have budgets. We all have limited resources from a team perspective, and we have to make hard decisions on where we do decide to spend our money. So then we move on to, you know, we've done this inventory. We've ensured we have an understanding of our regulatory requirements, and we've done a very high level light risk exercise. Now we can start talking about, well, what are our key risk indicators? That's what we just did, right? What are our key risk indicators, right? What types of threats should we be worrying about? How do we define that for our business specifically? So we should come out of that process with a list of, you know, high and, you know, moderate, extreme risk areas. Excuse me. And then how do we define performance? So in order to effectively define these, especially the key performance indicators, we have to be engaging subject matter experts across the business. That's a really important piece of this, is we can't be making decisions or measuring effectiveness in a vacuum. If we're not willing to reach across the aisle, engage, and ensure that we're a partner for the rest of our business, it's going to be really hard for us to have key performance indicators that we're going to have any kind of control over the success of, right? You can create a KPI, and if you have no control over how that the performance actually is accomplished, I mean, you might as well not even do it, right? I mean, so you have to have the buy-in. You have to have the business to say, come in and say, yeah, we agree that that's a reasonable thing to measure, and we agree that we're going to spend time and energy with you to try to spend time ensuring that we're securing that, or that we're you know, working towards that goal as a team. And that's going to take work on our side too, right? So that teamwork piece of it is incredibly important. We have to get out of the mindset of security are the people that slow us down and stop us, and move more into the mindset of security is an ally. The security team are a resource, and we're here to work together to try to accomplish the same goals. And if you can do that, it's not easy, but if you can do that, you're going to be able to create much more effective performance indicators. Performance indicators that are really going to be tied to things you can control and that you have buy-in for across the business. Identifying your priorities, right? Through the work we've done before, and then designing those combos, and then testing them, right? You have to be able to test and confirm your KPIs. Just a quick word on risk assessments. You know, I talked about this a little bit, but you know, they can be simple, they can be light, they can be easy. They don't have to be scary, right? So I think risk assessments, you go Google, like, how do I do a risk assessment? And it's like, oh my God. You know, it's, first of all, the concept is from like the financial world, and then it's overlaid into all these different business areas, and then we're talking about IT security, and you're trying to fit what can be sometimes a very complex process into IT security, which is not, it's not an easy leap sometimes to go from to take a look at, like, if you look at, you know, the Nist standard for risk assessment, it can be challenging. You read that through that documentation and you're like, I don't want to do that. Like, that's insane. It doesn't have to be that hard. It really, we're just trying to do a simple exercise to understand at a high level what does the landscape look like for our business. And then you compare. So you want to compare your assets, your risk indicators against what you're doing today. What does your cybersecurity program look like today? Where are you spending money? What resources have you invested in? And are they aligned? Like, if you have gone through this exercise and you compare that to where you're spending money today, there should be some pretty clear indicators of whether or not you're spending your time and energy effectively, right? So, you know, I used the example earlier of, you know, do you have, where is your sensitive data? Is that where you're spending your time and money protecting? Do you have a problem with access control, access management? Do you have a lot of remote workers? Do you have disparate data across a lot of different locations? Do you work with a lot of vendors that provide data? There's so many scenarios that define how you as an organization should be building a cybersecurity program. Having an understanding of what that looks like, that foundation, that landscape, before you, well, not before, but, and then comparing it to how you're spending money today, whether you're doing that during the budget cycle or whatever, it allows you, it gives you the tools that you need to be able to actually effectively say, yeah, we're spending the money where we should be spending money, or we could save some money, right? Maybe we're spending money on a tool that is overpowered for us. I mean, I know it's like sacrilege to say, like, spend less money on cybersecurity, and I'm not saying necessarily we should be going to cut our budgets, but there might be opportunities, right? There might be opportunities to say, hey, this should be focused elsewhere. So is it worth the effort that I just went through? Is it worth going through all these steps before you even start creating key performance indicators and things like that? I think it is, right? There's a lot of value here. Not only have you defined your critical assets, well, that's much nicer on the eyes. Not only have you defined your critical assets, you understand where your systems and your data reside, you've documented and communicated your relevant regulatory requirements, you've taken the effort to do this risk process and review, and now you have an understanding of what the value is of your current cybersecurity spend. If you have this data here, you can make an informed decision. You're not just going off of what, you know, I heard that social engineering is the most dangerous attack, you know, exploit or attack vector today, which, you know, I'm not saying that's not true. But maybe for your business, it's not as big of a problem, you know, for whatever reason. Maybe you don't use email. I don't know, I'm just kidding. But having an understanding of what the profile for your environment looks like lets you make informed decisions. Oops. It lets you make informed decisions around budget spend, around headcount, around product and solution selection, strategy planning. That's a big one. When we do a strategy session with an organization, the first thing we do is a quick risk exercise. You know, and we ask for information up front about assets and things like that. You know, we don't necessarily go through this whole process every time, but when we can, we do, right? It's really hard to do strategy planning for 1, 2, 3 years if you don't have an understanding of your foundational environment beforehand. It lets you make risk management decisions. Are you going to outsource this part of your business? Well, is there a piece of data around that risk assessment process that would have helped us make a decision from a business perspective on, do we want to leverage this vendor to outsource this part of our business? Well, often there is a talking point there, or something that we as cybersecurity professionals have to add to that decision, to that conversation. Like, yeah, okay, so you have all these other business decisions in relation to that, but here's something else to think about. Here's what the risk is from a cybersecurity perspective, and if we outsource, maybe we reduce our risk or shift the risk to this other organization. Those conversations, I think, are often not happening, and if we've gone through this process, we're already armed with that data to be able to help the rest of the organization make good decisions. And you're also then able to communicate measurable success indicators and the value of your program. So for example, if you've gone through this process and you have an understanding of where the risks are within your business. What are the high critical risks, threats to your business? Where's the high critical risk in relation to the threats of your business? You can then create a key performance indicator such as, through the implementation of X tool or X tool suite, our expectation is that we will have less than 2 major or less than 1 or 0 major events defined as in the next 12 months, right? You can make those anyway. You can just make them up today, and maybe we do. But if you have data that lets you focus on and define where the risks are within your organization, you can, the performance indicators you create are going to be better defined and more actionable and more measurable over time. And so, I can make up a lot of examples, but the important piece of that is that they are based off of the steps we took earlier to really define where the risk is associated within your business and where you need to be focusing your time, attention, and funds.
Making predictions like that, is there a fear that management would steer you towards those numbers? So let's say you make a prediction, I'm only going to have 1 in 12 months, and you end up having really 3, but management's only going to report on 1.
Well, so part of it is, okay, so the breach thing, we talked about that, and maybe that's not a great example for, sometimes it's hard. Organizations don't want to codify like we expect to have 3 breaches in the next 12 months, right? They just don't want to do that, right? But there are other ways to measure to say, you can, first of all, don't use the word breach, because half the time if you don't use the word, people are suddenly okay with using synonyms. Okay, fine. Define it differently, but ultimately say, like, okay, here's what we've implemented within our organization. We have PCI data, so yes, we're going to focus on reducing our PCI scope through these methods. Thereby, so our key performance indicator from a cybersecurity perspective would be in the next 12 months, or maybe in the next 24 months, we're going to eliminate all card processing where we store card data. That's a key performance indicator. Are we going to accomplish that in the next 12 months? That defines whether or not we've been successful in that particular endeavor. In relation to that, you can have a key performance indicator that says our expectation is that if we do periodic risk assessments within our organization, the overall risk profile of this environment, maybe our PCI environment, will be reduced from high today to moderate in the next 12 months. And again, you can just say that 12 months later and probably get away with it. But if you're really trying to measure, like, if your PCI environment is high risk right now because you store data, or because you're doing you control the form that credit card numbers are filled into instead of doing a redirect or an iframe or something, right? Those risk reduction methods for PCI specifically. If you know that makes your environment high risk today because you've done all this work to identify where's our data, what kind of risks are associated with our environment, you can create a key performance indicator that says we're going to reduce the risk of that environment through these steps. And the KPI is not going to have all the steps, but you say we're going to reduce the risk of that environment. We're going to assess it again in 6 months or in 12 months, and we're going to feel confident that we're going to change that from a high to a moderate. And that gives you an indicator that you can measure against for what your program will do over the next 6 to 12 months. Now, it's not everything your program's going to do. You're going to have more than one KPI. You're going to have a bunch of them probably. But it gives you something to go back to leadership and say, hey, we said we were going to reduce the risk of this environment. And you have to have a risk assessment process that's legit, so that people are like, oh, you didn't just call it medium moderate now, right? But assuming you have that framework in place within your organization, now you have something that you can come to them in 12 months and say, yeah, we were able to accomplish that, and this is how we did it. And so go ahead.
Just curious about tying some of these in with other aspects of IT, other units within IT potentially. Things like training and help desk, or how many computers have been re-imaged this year versus last year. Pulling those metrics in and tying. If phishing is the issue, we've done training, we've reduced the number of computers that we've had to re-image due to phishing success, things like that.
I think that's a great
point,
right?
Moving that direction.
Yeah, there's definitely, back to the engaging with the other business units conversation, that's absolutely true, right? There are going to be indicators within other aspects of the organization that could have a direct impact on the work that you're doing, right? And so yeah, if you determine that phishing is a big risk, you can take the steps to work with that business unit to say, how can we find a definition of success here together as a team, and ensure that we have control over that to some extent, right? But yeah, you can leverage, I think that's great, and it fosters that communication and integration across teams, right? And I think as security is a supporting business unit in so many organizations, well, really any organization really, it should be treated like that. That is the right approach, right? Our customers are the rest of the business, and so being able to work with them to define these makes a huge amount of sense to me.
I just want to add, security has to have a seat at the table at every technology discussion.
100%, absolutely, and these are foundational challenges that we face as cybersecurity professionals, and I think we're starting to see a change in that as organizations start to understand, like, hey, we can't just wing this, right? We have to really, how long have CISOs existed in their current form, even as a role, for instance, or understand that part of our business, or that part of our, and part of it is also, I think, a lot of times we have a seat, it's like we're kind of dead in the water. What else? So, back to, we can ask the right questions now, right? So we have enough data to say, what are the highest risks? How do those assets align with those risks? Where are we spending money that we shouldn't be on today? And really, like, I'm going to tell you a secret. My underlying hope behind talking about these things is to continue to drive to organizations that they need to be thinking about the basic blocking and tackling of IT security before they start worrying about the next big thing, right? If we can just get folks to, and these processes, these steps will help do that, right? This is, I'm not claiming any of this is rocket science. What I am saying, though, is that if you do the work, if you've seen this in action, if you do the work that I've outlined, right, the steps, the asset inventory, really understanding that, like the risk assessment, understanding your compliance requirements, and then putting that together and using that data to assess how you're doing with your cybersecurity program, with your budget, with your initiatives that you've outlined, you're going to, as an organization, reduce the risk, period. And that's going to draw out things like, oh, well, we should probably focus on patch management. We're not doing a very good job there. I know we just implemented this really cool, network monitoring solution, which might be great, but we're not even patching. And so, okay, well, maybe we need to focus on the high-risk areas, and then we'll work our way up to that. Just being able to go in with an informed decision, it makes a difference. It makes a difference, especially when you're trying to convince folks that don't necessarily understand what we do and why we do it, what our decision process looks like. It helps to have some sort of ammunition there. This clarity allows you to make better decisions. It gives you some effectiveness metrics to be able to really measure, okay, these are the initiatives I've outlined this year. These are the performance indicators I've assigned in relation to those. Now I can measure that over time. And you're going to measure that in a bunch of different ways, and you're going to have different steps below, your KPIs. That's not the end-all, be-all. That's just the high level, here's what you communicate up to management, let's say. But it gives you something to drive towards. And if you create a KPI that's directly aligned with the projects and things that you're working on, it's going to make it's easier to express how you're being effective in your job and how your program is effective. And visibility over time, right? This is not a one-time process. This is something you have to build in and do on a regular basis. And that even includes doing a risk assessment every time you decide to bring on a new solution or tool or bring on a new system, right? Risk assessment is a multi-layered approach. And then efficiency, right? If you understand where the risk is in your environment, you don't have to take this blanket approach or the shotgun approach. You can be more efficient with where you spend your time and energy. And it allows you to spend the time up front in those specific areas to create efficiencies. To, let's say, okay, we have a log management solution and it covers, how are we doing on time? Okay. We're a log management solution and we've got all the logs, got them all, they're all coming in. It's great, centralized log management. What are you doing with that data? How much of that do you need? Are all those systems high risk? Should you be pouring all of that into your, can help you make that decision to say, hey, yeah, we're going to store those other logs, specific systems, and that's going to allow us to spend time to make that more efficient, to automate some of that, right?
Some of the compliance stuff require you to collect.
But not all of it's going to be alerting us or being put into dashboards that we look at, making that decision, tuning, right?
It's all there forensically.
Exactly. As long as you have it, that's important, and you have to understand. You have to have a good enough understanding that you're not, shunting something off for storage for forensic purposes when you really could be using that data, but you don't need all of it. And trying to use all of it is one of the things that we're constantly trying to overcome. That's an example, but we're often overwhelmed with data, right? And where to spend our time as IT security professionals, because there's a million places we can spend our time. If we can define or narrow down where we should be spending our time and most of our focus, it allows us to be focused and take our time and then maybe create efficiencies in that area. Like, I'm going to spend the time to create a script to do this action that I've been doing manually because I haven't had time to write the script because I've been doing 400 other things that are probably really low risk and I should be spending less time on it. The goal is to be able to empower you to be able to make better decisions and create efficiencies so that you have a healthier program over time. Other benefits, employee engagement and retention. If you have a defined program and a plan, you'd be astonished how much easier it is to keep people if they feel like the people you work for know what they're trying to accomplish and that you can measure your success as a part of that. It makes a big difference. It's really hard right now. All of us know how hard it is to hire and retain IT security professionals right now. If you can create an environment where they feel like they're making a difference and that they can clearly understand how and where, and that you have a plan, it's going to make a huge difference towards retention. It's not all about the money, right? Yeah, you can go make a lot of money, but if you are, and of course everybody wants to get paid a reasonable amount, right? But you can go out and get paid 30% more and work for a really bad company, and you're probably going to regret that decision. And maybe you don't even do that. Maybe you decide to say, hey, I really like this place. I like who I work for. I like knowing that I'm making a difference. I feel like I understand where I fit. It makes a huge difference. The value of the cybersecurity program will increase within the rest of your organization if you function in these ways. Show that you have a process for this. Because that's what they do. Most other business units have a process one, and this will speak to them, right? Be able to say, hey, we do this just like you guys do. Increased collaboration, really important. I'm going to continue to hammer that home. If you're not collaborating with the rest of your business units, you're going to have a hard time being successful from a cybersecurity perspective. And it improves your project and your team velocity, your ability to move quickly if you have defined goals and you're not just trying to do everything for everybody. We talked about efficiency. So with that, I would just suggest that everybody do it. Just do it, right? So that's what I've got for you guys today. I would love to open up the floor for questions. We've had some folks with some really good thoughts and feedback, and I have more candy if you want to. I'm afraid to throw any more of it, but what do you guys think? Thoughts? Your experiences?
So you mentioned risk assessments kind of daunting.
Can be.
Especially looking at Nist and some of the options that are out there. Have you found a good simplified framework that kind of builds up?
No, not necessarily. But what I do is I look at Octave, Nist, Dread, Stride, whatever, and I take the pieces that I like from it and I make my own. I feel like if we understand what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish, we don't have to read the whole standard. We just need to say what, and just at a really basic level, super simple definition of risk assessment. You have threats, and you have the impact of those threats and the likelihood of those threats in the context of your business, and then out of that, you rank those by moderate, high, low, and then you come out with a risk level. I mean, that's super simple, and there's a million ways to make that more complex, and maybe that's something you get to do next year or something, But if you start with the simple definition of at least going through that effort, that process, that's worthwhile. Versus getting wrapped around the axle around, do I really know how to do this risk assessment? It doesn't have to be quantitative. It can just be, I need to have a rough understanding at a high level for my organization. And so, I'll take, bits and pieces from each of those, but for the most part, I try to keep it really, really light and simple. and I also try to curate it when I'm doing those for a group of people. If I can get people in a room to do a risk assessment, like different business units, and have them involved in it, I mean, you have to keep it simple and light in order to keep them engaged.
How about, so just as by way of background, my job is network engineer. My segue into InfoSec is I manage equipment, firewalls and similar things for that have InfoSec related duties. So I work with people whose titles are security analysts and work with SOCs and things like that. What about pushing the security, not even requirements, but the security goals into the different units? How much, how many, what's success, what's ways to do that? I mean, you talked about engaging with them, but how do you get it into a purchasing requirement? Things like that.
So it has to start from the top down in that regard. Not that you can't, I mean, obviously you can bring these ideas up, but support for something like that, to be able to say, hey, we're going to have a security culture. Because you're right, security is everybody's responsibility. You might have people that are experts in it that help drive the initiatives or specific tasks that they manage or whatever, but really it is an organizational responsibility, and the responsibilities differ depending on your role, your department, things like that, your level. But it does need to be organizational in the perfect world. But that's hard to achieve because we're talking about organizational cultural change, and that is a challenge, right? When we come in, we've done virtual CISO projects forever, and the first sign of success or failure is whether or not leadership feels like buying in, right? Are they going to really push this? Are they going to talk about it? Are they going to back you up? And then you can define really quickly, like, hey guys, this is not going to work, right? If you aren't supporting us, I'm just the consultant guy that nobody has to listen to or doesn't want to listen to. And it's the same thing with security. If you don't have the support from the top down to say, hey, this is something that we think is important for everyone, and we're not asking you all to become security experts, but we are asking you to engage and be a part of the process. And so if you can create an awareness program for that, it can be successful. And we have seen it be successful. Obviously, a lot easier in smaller organizations, much easier in organizations that are in the technology field, but definitely doable regardless. I mean, I've walked into organizations, we've done social engineering in organizations that do marketing basically, right? Data, they do data analysis, and you can't even get in the front door because the front desk woman's like, I don't think so. I know how this works. You're not a real printer fixer person. We don't even have this kind of printer. And you're like, wow, like they've taken the time to create that culture, and everybody has their role, and they embrace it, and they believe in it, and it's positive reinforcement, and so I think that you do need to be able to push that out to the whole organization, but that's a much longer process, and it's a bigger project, So.
Kind of building on that, I think you're totally that might not understand security at that depth that they should, and there's an argument to be had there, but a lot of times I find that we're saying, hey, XYZ needs to be done, right? We need better segmentation of the network, whatever the case may be. Sometimes certain people don't understand why, right? They're just doing it. Well, I just do it. I build the network. I spin up the servers. I don't know anything after that.
Yeah, I follow this hardening list, and I don't know why.
That's something that you can. That doesn't necessarily have to be a top down.
I think it makes sense. I think that's a great point, right? You can make a difference at that level if you take. And I think the challenge that we face is a lot of times those of us that are in these roles maybe aren't the type of people that are used to going out and training people on how to do stuff, right? Like part of it is like a cultural piece.
As I said, I wouldn't be the guy training.
Right, and so who's that person, right?
Yeah.
And so it's hard because it takes us out of our comfort zone, right? To say like, oh, now I have to sit down and like, I'll be honest, like when my aunt is like, hey, can you go look at my laptop? I'm like, I don't know anything about what's going on with your laptop. Okay, hold on, let me take a deep breath and help you, right? It's like being able to have that patience to help people understand the concept that they don't necessarily have experience with is not something we all have naturally. right? We're not all natural teachers, and that's what I think is a really important missing piece, is that being able to do that work, to be able to teach why this is important, or express it in more than just a transactional method.
So I work at a really large firm, and just kind of like, I'm just kind of thinking, there's so many different vectors and stuff, and to go ahead and have a unified way of getting all of it and getting the assessment and stuff, they're going to be out of sync a lot of times. You might get one part that has good metrics, and then 6 months later or a year, the other side gets, and you just never have a clear picture. And since it's not a continuous way of maintaining what I saw there, I don't see how you're going to have at a given time, what is my snapshot if it's just scale.
Well, and at the level that we talked about, you're right? So we're talking about at the very highest level, creating those kind of metrics that might be measured over the course of 6 months or a year or 2 years. But below those metrics, you would dig in and you would create actionable goals, tasks, projects. You would flesh it out to the point where you would be able to more easily, more granularly measure success. Now, how that aligns with other business units or other teams, or even if you're talking about within your own security department, maybe you have it segregated out by network security versus server security versus I don't know what else, whatever. But that just takes constant communication, and that doesn't mean constant meetings. I'm anti-meeting, but it does mean the ability to communicate across groups and have whether that means the output of this is put into some sort of a visual form that we put somewhere that people refer to a lot, or someplace that we, providing people with that data and the constant reminders is a part of it, and the other part of it is making sure you're communicating and knowing who you should be communicating with if things start to get out of sync, right? If you have different teams with different initiatives, how do we ensure that we're all driving back towards that key performance indicator if we have a joint? And it's not easy, but these are very high level. You would then drill down and try to create goals that are a little bit more actionable in a shorter time. But it isn't like, you can't probably go through this process necessarily and then in a month, how am I doing? Am I 25% there or not? It's not necessarily that granular, but you would get more granular as you kind of build out your strategy below it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. The really high level is feasible to do relatively quickly, basically.
Yeah.
And then when you decide, okay, I'm going to do my high risk item, then I'll do a granular. So you don't need to keep the granular updated. That's not expected. Really.
Exactly.
That's what you said.
Yeah,
Okay.
right. I mean, and that's the idea is like so we're all making decisions. We're all picking projects to do. We're all doing work. We're busy. But are we starting in the right place? Are we making those decisions based on the right data? That's really what this is about. All the other stuff you're probably already doing, and maybe there are things you need to do better with how you approach them or not, but really the key here is, are we starting with the right foundation so that we really can determine if we're being effective or not, beyond just saying, yeah, we implemented that tool, that's what we said we were doing this year.
Are you inferring a scope-based starting point, or are you taking it as a holistic across the organization depending on size?
I mean, it's really dependent on like how much of a bite you can take, but I mean, you want to start as you can probably apply these concepts in more than one way, right? So if you wanted to apply the same concept on a more scoped down, so for instance, you can go through this process strictly for your PCI environment if you wanted.
Or go through your AWS environment, go through your desktop environment, go through your...
Yeah, if that's easier, if you have different teams, different resources, or if they're very clearly defined, there's no reason why you couldn't break this up, as long as you're keeping organizational, like, departmental, whatever, rolling them up to some sort of higher level. Yeah, you can absolutely break it up, because I mean, this could be a several week process in the right organization, and that's not really what you want to do, right? So yeah, absolutely break it up.
So this is all dependent on people being objective, right? Because I have a client that will, you set a KPI, he'll meet every one of them, right? So I mean, how do you like push that part of it?
So dig a little bit more. Are you saying like you can,
So
if you give somebody one?
So if we set a KPI, regardless of what it is, to some degree that's subjective. Like there's lives, there's damn lives, there's
Sure.
right? He's gonna meet every one of his KPIs because it's just he doesn't want to look bad in other businesses.
Yep.
So how do you like reinforce? All right, if we go down this, we do this, we need to be sincere and objective. And
Well,
do it.
that's hard, right? I mean, part of that is organizational culture. Part of it is how you create those KPIs, creating them in a way that is less prone necessarily to manipulation in that sense. And maybe not all of them are, but maybe some of them are, right? Maybe one of them is pretty all-encompassing. So to your point, like maybe you create a bunch of KPIs and they're all met, and you're still, target, and you're still hacked, right? Like somehow you're PCI compliant and you still are not PCI compliant, right? Like there are ways to get around any kind of data point you create, like you said. But what you're trying to do is well, first of all, you should be creating the KPIs so that you can show your value to others, and hopefully you're doing that from the right place. Because if you're trying to make up KPIs that are easy to hit and not necessarily value add to the organization, that will come out at some point. And unfortunately, probably in a really negative way. But if you're creating KPIs to try to force other people to do things, you're going to have, that's harder, right? This is really more about you as a leader within an organization saying, I want to have an understanding of how I can express my team is doing a good job. And so that is a challenge that kind of goes above and beyond that, and is more about holding people accountable and measuring effectiveness of people and those specific people in their jobs.
Just to add on to that, part of the success, I work in a larger organization, part of the success for our KPIs and indicators have been senior leadership communicating down that if you are reporting that you're meeting all of your KPIs and are all well and good, that means really you probably don't need additional headcount, you probably don't need additional budgeting. So to tell the story, not just, sorry, my throat is raspy this morning, that you're succeeding and this is my value, but it's also an indicator to show whether or not your team's struggling as well. So a lot of times that's typically been the messaging from senior leadership. And if there's areas where I work in an internal audit department, the senior leaders will actually reach out to us and say, hey, can you do a deep dive of this area to see how these metrics are actually bubbling up? And can you actually do more hands-on assessments to either validate or invalidate whether those metrics are being reported up accurately? We've come across a lot of instances where numbers have been getting fudged, and really to your point, it was the behavior was being driven to be green on the dashboard to meet the KPIs, not necessarily communicate up what's actually going on in an organization. So, it's probably unique in the company I work for that we're larger and able to either get outside counsel or turn an audit department in to do a deep dive assessment of those areas, but also something to keep in mind as a possibility.
Yeah, having that checks and balances.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate you guys taking the time and being a great audience and asking a lot of really good questions. And I hope you got something out of this. I certainly enjoy talking about this topic, and I feel like there's a lot of value here, even if it's not the sexiest topic we're going to talk about over the course of this conference. I'm excited to go see some other talks. Thank you guys, really appreciate it, and yeah, I'll talk to you all later.